Is Ohio on the cusp of reintroducing elk to the state? That's kind of a crazy question, but just so happens to be the topic of a brand new bill that just came across the floor in Columbus. Hi, I'm Ricky with Good Taxidermy. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'm not sure how many of us are aware of this in the Ohio hunting community, but yes, this is a bill, and if passed, would sponsor a feasibility study. It would allocate $1 million to the Division of Wildlife to do a feasibility study on reintroducing elk to Ohio. That doesn't mean if it passes we get elk, but it is step one. If a state wants to reintroduce elk, step one is doing a feasibility study. Not unlike our neighbors, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and the most recent West Virginia. They have all three had successful reintroduction of elk, although the species that we had here no longer exist. The eastern elk, sometimes referred to as the American elk, went extinct in 1877. John James Audubon has a really famous painting called The American Elk, where he depicts a bull and cow eastern elk. And kind of a little known fact, but if you do some digging, you'll see John James Audubon actually spent a ton of time on the Ohio River between Pennsylvania and Ohio and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So kind of interesting piece of history there. Let's look at a timeline of the history of elk in Ohio, in Appalachia, in the Allegheny Mountains, and all through this kind of Midwest Appalachian region here, the gateway to the West back in the late 1700s. Okay, so in 1835, the last eastern elk in Ohio was shot in Ashtabula County. They believe there were two left. One was killed by a Native American man, one was killed by a white man. Both were killed in 1835. In 1851, John James Audubon wrote that only a few elk remain in the Allegheny Mountains, remarking on just how low the population had become. 1877, the last eastern elk was killed in Pennsylvania, and they are now extinct. That is a subspecies of elk that was domiciled in North America, eastern North America, and no longer exists. So let's fast forward here to 1913. Pennsylvania ships in 50 elk from Yellowstone via train. They paid $30 a piece for those elk, probably a lot better price than the ODNR will eventually pay. Fingers crossed. 1923, the first bull elk season for Pennsylvania, but sometime between 1923 and 1997 kind of became the dark ages for elk. Pennsylvania's population really dwindled even below 200 at one point. Between the World Wars, between the Great Depression and World Wars, elk became less and less of a priority to the public and to the local government. And in the 70s, some biologists got together in Pennsylvania and said, we've never studied our elk herd. Maybe we can do some things to improve it. And since then they have. And in fact, in 2001, when Kentucky had their first elk season, Pennsylvania had their first elk season in 70 years. So in 1997, Kentucky conducts an elk reintroduction feasibility study, and later that year, relocation efforts began. Let's see here, between 1997 and 2002, 1,541 elk from donor herds in 6 western states were relocated to Kentucky. In 2005, West Virginia held an elk habitat site feasibility study. In 2016, 24 elk from Kentucky were released in the West Virginia coal fields. And in 2024, there were some more elk relocated from Kentucky to West Virginia, and that brought their total population in 2024 to 130. There's still no West Virginia hunting season yet. Their herd is pretty young, pretty small, but another native land to the eastern elk, and very cool that they are back where they belong. So kind of cool. So the eastern elk, although a giant bummer of a story, overhunted, habitat loss, but really it was overhunting. And so in a lot of ways, hunters are to blame for the loss of the eastern elk. And in a lot of ways, hunters will be to blame if they come back. And I think that's something to be proud of. They went extinct due to the hands of the hunters, and now due to the same folks a few generations later, we are bringing them back. So I think that's something to be proud of. Hunters should hang their hat on these conservation wins. Stuff like this would not happen without hunting. If people wouldn't line up to put in a chance for a Kentucky bull tag or a cow tag, Kentucky may not have ever relocated those elk. So, and look at the success they are. So I don't know. That's just kind of exciting. I think growing up in Ohio, we don't hear so much about that kind of past in the river and how shallow the river was and the salmon that were in the river. And I think the elk and the bear and the bison that were in Ohio in the 1700s are not often discussed. And there's a lot of historical narratives. Well, Allen Eckert is a super well-known author when it comes to settling the West. And, Appalachia was the gateway to the West. Southern Ohio was the gateway to the West. Fort Pitt up in Pennsylvania, that's where all these trips started. They'd get on the river and they'd follow it into the West. And you can hear more about that and kind of the history of the Ohio Valley, and also the history of the elk herds of the Ohio Valley are mentioned several times in Allen Eckert's The Frontiersmen, one of my absolute favorite books. Huge recommendation. It is not in publication anymore. It is not in print, so you can buy some used copies on Amazon. I'll put a link, and then you can also buy them on eBay and from used bookstores, but they're not making them anymore, and it's a killer book. Another great book that discusses the settlers and also elk and other major fauna in the 17 and 1800s here in Appalachia is a book called The Pioneers by David McCullough. An amazing book. Couldn't recommend either of those enough. If you want to get deeper into some of this history, pick those two up. Those are a great start. Also, Allen Eckert's A Dark and Bloody River is a great book as well. So the bill is HB 641. It was introduced by Representative Justin Pizzulli of the 90th District in Ohio, which is Scioto and Adams County, and it allocates $2 million to a feasibility study for ATV trails, side-by-side trail expansion throughout the state, and then it also allocates $1 million to the Division of Wildlife to conduct an elk feasibility study. So that's all this bill talks about. It doesn't talk about bringing elk here. It simply talks about funding a feasibility study. And per the bill, the timeline's pretty interesting. The money has to be paid within the fiscal year of 2026 to the Division of Wildlife if this passes. And by the end of 2028, the final report of the feasibility study has to be presented to the State House General Assembly and the governor.
And if you look historically at our neighboring states, that could mean you could have elk in the state as little as 12 months after that feasibility study. Now, it's perfect storm kind of stuff. 2029 could start the reintroduction process. When you look at our neighboring states, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, West Virginia, and we see the successes they're having, just wild successes, just huge wins for conservation and putting native animals back on native lands. So if you're down for that, this is a pretty interesting bill. And I don't know how many people in the Ohio hunting community know that this is in existence. This just came about in January 2026. So the bill hasn't been voted on, but it will be voted on at some point.
Kentucky did a feasibility study, and a year later, they were putting elk on the ground in Kentucky. Now, I can't imagine it would be that quick, but it's pretty exciting to think that the feasibility study could be wrapped up in 2028. And then it's just a logistical question of where are the elk coming from and what's it going to take to get them here. Don't mind the girls here. They're just flying around the yard. Did one of them hit the house? Are you okay? That's so crazy. Anyways, if you want to be a part of putting native animals back on native lands, this is something we need to get behind. If you're an outdoorsman, if you're a sportsman or sportswoman, if you enjoy the outdoors, this is something to get excited about. So wanted to make you aware. Didn't know if how many folks realize that this is on the table right now, and up for discussion. And it hasn't been voted on. It will. If you think this is important, reach out to your local state rep. Yeah, and I'll have a link to the official document in the description if you want to read it in full. Like I said, it's only 7 pages, but there you go. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was informative. I appreciate it. And if you disagree with this, let me know in the comments. I know there's going to be a lot of people freaking out about, what about car accidents? What about elk eating people's gardens? They're looking at remote areas. They're looking at the southern part of the state. And we hit a lot of deer anyways, guys. So anyways, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Cheers.
All right, important question, and one that we're not going to ask the kids. Where'd the ducks go? Maybe our little girls flew off. Maybe they joined up with their cousins and migrated south. Well, that's a bad sign. I don't hear them or see them, and they have not kept any of this open. Do I hear the girls? Here, I got some food for you. Come on. There you go. Eat your food. They don't even see it. The girls are alive.